Thank you for having me. I appreciate the invitation, Morgan. It's always a lot of fun to share my toxic plants with people. I've been a diagnostic toxicologist at TVMDL, the Vet Diagnostic Lab, for almost 30 years now, and I trained specifically in the toxic plants with Dr. John Rager, who was here previous to me. And I have to say it's been a very rewarding experience. So I hope I can bring part of that information to you today. Why did it not change? Advance, click. Ah, yay. Okay. One of the things that we talk about in extension and also in diagnostics is knowing about integrated toxic plant management. So one of the things we're doing is trying to help you identify potential toxic plants in your region. And we'll talk through some of the symptoms in the various livestock animals that those plants can cause. We'll also talk a little bit about how those plants like to grow so that you can recognize problem areas in the pasture. And then the main way to minimize livestock losses from toxic plants is to always make sure that there's hay out before you run out of pasture. Never graze that pasture too short. And you never want to let animals graze after you've just treated with herbicide or fertilizer. Either one of those things is going to change the palatability of the plants that have been treated with it and that are affected. So anything that changes the plant's growth rate or causes it to die will change the taste of that plant. A lot of plants become sweeter as they die. And so animals that wouldn't eat them normally will go after them just because they are sweet at that time. Several of the cases that we've had of toxic plant poisonings have been on the heels of treatment with herbicides specifically. So we'll talk through a little bit of that. Excuse me. One of the tools we have for integrated toxic plant management is this publication that we put out, I think in the year 2000. You can get hold of this in the AgriLife bookstore. Each plant in the book, we have a page of its distribution and habitat. We've got a little map here that shows where it is. We talk about the toxin if we know what it is, and then the clinical signs that you would see in livestock. And finally, how to deal with that plant if you have it in your pasture. So this has been a good cooperation among the diagnostic toxicologists and the extension range specialists from some years ago. And it's really been a helpful aid for me to have here in the lab. But when I go out plant shopping and taking pictures of things, it's been really helpful for me to make sure I'm identifying the right plant. So you might want to get hold of that if you can. It's still available. It's also available at Barnes & Noble, but they want more for it than they should. Anyway, it's a good aid to have here in Texas. One of the basic things that we always need to think about when we're thinking of toxins is that it's always going to be the dose that makes something poisonous. So with our toxic plants, we may have a variety of different things in the pasture. And yes, 3 or 4 of them may be toxic, but as long as the animal doesn't chow down on just one species, it's probably going to be okay. So if you dilute the toxin with plenty of other forage, they're probably not going to get enough to bother them. In every case, there's a threshold where you have an effect. So at this point, it's beneficial. So if you were taking your aspirin and you took this much, you'd have a beneficial effect or therapeutic effect. Anyway, Paracelsus maxim, which is a basis of toxicology, is it's always the dose that makes the poison. So it all depends on how much of that plant they get, whether it's going to cause trouble or not. Now, one plant that it doesn't take much is oleander. So I always start with a drop dead plant, as I call them. And this is one that is going to kill very quickly. It only takes between 10 and 15 leaves to kill a horse or a cow. And frequently it kills them fast enough that you find them with plant material still in their mouth. And if you did a necropsy or an examination of the dead animal, you would find it very close to the point in their stomach where you see the stuff that they just swallowed. So oleander is going to stop the heart. It inhibits the sodium potassium ATPase in cardiac muscle. And so it damages the muscle itself when it attacks that point. And so if you have enough muscle attacked at the same time, the animals typically will drop dead. They may, if they get a lower dose, drop dead slower. So they may be stumbly because they're not getting enough oxygen to the brain. They may be a little drunk acting and die soon after that. The problem with oleander is it's almost always going to be fatal. It's also toxic even when it's dry. So the toxin does not go away when the plant material dries. So a lot of times some kind soul will go and trim the bushes and go dump it over the fence into the pasture so those sweet animals can eat this free food. And that's when we get a lot of our poisonings, if the livestock get into a pile of this stuff. This is going to be toxic to pretty much any species that gets into it. All of our mammals for sure. I don't know that we know about birds, but all the mammals for sure, this is going to kill them. It's pretty, it's very drought tolerant. You don't have to use much in the way of pesticides on it. So it's used as an ornamental a lot, and it has escaped. So we do have it starting to show up in places where it's not been planted. It's also very freeze sensitive. So we lost a lot of it this year in a lot of areas in Texas. So that might be a good thing. We'll see. One of the crazy things is they've planted this all the way around the dog training, the obedience training parking lot that they use here at the vet school. So I've always thought that was kind of an odd thing. Just sense of humor type stuff. Another one of our drop dead plants is Cocklebur, but only up to the 4-leaf stage. So, you know, this is a full-size Cocklebur plant that's got new seed on it and everything. The seeds themselves and the cotyledonary leaves, the first pair of leaves as that seed splits and moves upward, are the most toxic parts of this plant. So where you're going to have trouble is as puddles start receding, or around playa lakes, as the lakes start to dry up, the Cocklebur is going to come up, and this seedling stage is the most toxic stage of the plant. And that's when they'll eat it because it's tender and special, and there's other stuff out there that's a little drier and not so attractive. But this has a toxin in it called carboxyatractylicide. And the main thing you need to know about that is that it causes a very serious hypoglycemia. So animals that get too much of this will pretty much drop straight down, sternal. They don't struggle. They don't get back up. And if they live long enough, they'll have very massive liver damage. So this causes necrosis in all the liver cells. So if they don't die flat out from the hypoglycemia that occurs, the low blood sugar, then they will die of liver failure after that. So animals that eat Cocklebur are usually found dead without previous clinical signs. And they're often found within about 50 yards of the source of the Cocklebur seedlings. So every now and then in a bad year, we'll have a ring of dead animals around a receding playa lake. You know, one here, one off in another direction at you know, similar distance from the receding water. And if you go back to the edge of that water, you're going to find some leftover Cocklebur seedlings. It's toxic to all mammals.
Dr. Barr, we had a question in the chat box come up from Noel Troxclair, and he asked if the dried leaves are more palatable.
On Cocklebur?
I believe so.
They are more palatable on oleander.
On oleander, okay.
Yes. The oleander leaves are definitely more palatable when they're dry and dead. Thanks, Noel.
Yep.
Because it's got kind of an odor to it when it's green. but that goes away when it dries. But the toxin sure doesn't.
Okay. Yep. And Noel just confirmed it was related to oleander. So
Okay.
good point. Thank you.
Yeah. Okay. Let's go back. I think I'm done with Cocklebur. Massive liver damage, hypoglycemia. It can happen throughout the year as playa lakes or puddles are receding, but most of our Cocklebur poisoning happens in the springtime. So a lot of it may already be gone it depends on the area where you're from. As it grows into a bigger plant, it's significantly less toxic. So up to the 4-leaf stage. This one's Bagpod Sesbania, Sesbania vesicaria. It grows in well-drained soils and it can be up to 10 feet tall. This sucker, sometimes I have to lay on the ground to take a picture of a plant against a sky background, and this one you just don't have to do that. So it's really tall. It's really airy in its structure. It's a legume and it puts on legume type seeds, and the seeds are the most toxic part of the plant. Now this one's distinctly stinky, I swear. So they don't typically eat this plant when it's green. The problem with this one is that it will still be standing wherever it grew, dead, and the seeds on it will be dry and dead, and then the animals will get into it. And the seeds are the most toxic part. They look like black-eyed peas, only they're green. They're a little bit bigger. I think Goodbye Earl may have been in reference to this plant, if anybody's curious about country music. So animals that eat this are usually found dead with no warning. They don't have a whole lot of clinical signs, so there's no real noticing that they're sick before they're dead from this. And there's almost no lesions when a veterinarian does a necropsy on that animal. We've done several posts on them, and the only thing you see is a single cell death in liver cells. One here, one there, one another place. You know, I talked about Cocklebur causing massive necrosis or massive death of liver cells. This plant, the only problem you see in that animal is that it's got a dead liver cell here and there. So we don't know what the toxin is yet. It hasn't been identified. And we just know that every now and then we'll have a dead cow and she'll have these green black-eyed peas and pod material in the rumen content. So it's a strange plant, and we're not sure why it works, but it sure does. So that's Bagpod Sesbania. This one grows, it's in tighter soils. It's a little bit inland from the coast and sort of central Texas, and then swooping eastward across the southeastern US is where you're going to find this one. Often in small grain fields, you'll still see this standing dead in the rye or the oat field during the winter. And that's when they're going to go after it, because this will be the only roughage available with that lush green forage. So you always want to have hay out, especially in the cases where you have this plant available. This is broadleafed milkweed. This one in particular is antelope horns. And milkweeds are bad news. The good news is nobody eats them when they're out in the pasture. If you notice you're driving by a pasture that's really short, you'll still see the milkweed standing out there. It's because they don't go near it. It's got a really irritating white sap. So they typically don't eat it. Now, if it goes into hay, they will eat it. So the bitterness, like oleander, the bitterness of this one goes away. And if it's in the hay, they'll eat it, but the toxin's still present. In broadleaf milkweeds, it's a cardiotoxin. So again, it's causing problem in that heart muscle. And that's where their sudden death is going to come in. They can convulse before they die because of the anoxia, the low oxygen level getting to the brain. So this one's not quite as fast as oleander. but they can be just as dead. But it is a heart toxin. Western world milkweed and the verticillate milkweeds are a different story. These really narrow-leaved ones with leaves that go around the stem as they go up, they have a neurotoxin in them. And Eastern world milkweed, you don't see a whole lot of poisonings with because it doesn't grow in big stands. But the Western world milkweed, like we have here in the Panhandle and Colorado, northern New Mexico, and westward, northwestward from there. These have the neurotoxin in them, and they grow by rhizomatous spread. So you can have a big stand of this stuff. And if the animals get into it, they sure can get enough of it to cause neurotoxicity and death. This happens in horses and cattle. It is a plant that will grow in the same conditions that alfalfa likes to grow. And if it's one of the weeds at the edge of the alfalfa patch, it's very easy to bale this stuff up in with the alfalfa. And it's very hard to see in baled alfalfa. So that's one of the cases where we get some of our poisonings if the alfalfa has been contaminated with Western world milkweed. We also have cattle that'll go out and just, they get in the middle of that stand of milkweed and just eat it. And we have had cattle die from it just eating it out in the pasture. This is one that's, it's fun to try to distinguish this in alfalfa flake. So it's something that you have to have your eye tuned for, and it can be a real problem. Excuse me. Another one of my drop dead plants is carelessweed or pigweed, Amaranthus. It grows all over the place, everywhere. Its problem is that it actively accumulates nitrate from the soil. So if a place has been fertilized and then some pigweed comes in and colonizes a bare spot, it can gather up as much as 12% nitrate. That's what we've measured. It only takes 1% to poison ruminants. So this plant can be really, really talented as far as killing cows goes. The reason that it affects ruminants is that the rumen microbes will convert the nitrate to nitrite, NO2, and nitrite binds hemoglobin. So if you've got something binding hemoglobin other than oxygen, that blocks the blood from taking up oxygen when it goes through the lungs. And so if it's not able to pick up oxygen, it can't deliver oxygen to the tissues. And the place that affects most is the brain. So if it blocks oxygen to the brain for long enough, the animals are struggling to breathe and they're stumbling and they can die from that. So nitrite binds the hemoglobin more tightly than oxygen will. So the animals are blocked from using oxygen. Now this toxin is either, when they get into pigweed, if they don't get too much, they're going to be fine in 4 hours. If they do get too much, they're going to be dead. But it's a toxin that they're either dead or better within about 4 hours when it's a nitrate poisoning. There is an antidote for nitrate, which is unusual. It's very rare for there to be an antidote for plant poisoning. But it's very unusual that someone will be able to contact a veterinarian and get them there fast enough to administer the antidote. So it's almost pointless. The take-home message really is to not turn out a bunch of cattle into a small trap that's loaded with pigweed, because it's going to be a bad situation. We can find the pigweed in the rumen content. We can detect nitrate and nitrite in ocular fluid, in the fluid within the eye from an animal that's dead. It's only ruminants. This doesn't happen in horses or dogs or any of the monogastrics or animals with a single stomach. It's only the rumen microbes that make this a toxic problem. Now I've got a couple slides in a row that deal with sennas. This one is coffee senna, and it grows along the Texas coast, northward to about, I'm gonna say maybe Pittsburgh or so, and then eastward all the way to the East Coast. So this plant is available across a wide area of geography here. It's usually consumed after a hard freeze because of the change in palatability. It's another stinky plant that they don't normally eat when it's green, although the toxin's present in the whole plant, and if they did eat it when it was green, they would be poisoned just as badly. So they usually eat it after a freeze. In cattle, it causes alert downers. And the reason for that is because it destroys the muscle tissue. So, you know, this is not a really good looking steak type tissue here. I wouldn't want to eat that. And the animal could not stand on muscle that's that damaged. This is a little bit less damaged. You see the color difference. Necrotic tissue is usually a lighter color because it's begun to die. So if they have severe large muscle group damage, that's going to be their shoulders and their haunches. You can talk to that cow. She's alert. She will eat if you put food in front of her. She'll drink. She is not getting back up because of damage in that muscle tissue. She's unable to rise. And she's dumped all the color, all the myoglobin from that muscle into the bloodstream, and it's been filtered out by the kidneys into the urine. So the coffee colored urine is what gives this plant its name, the coffee senna. Then that myoglobin piles up in the kidneys and they die of renal failure. So if they're down and you can't get them to move to try to get up, it may be a coffee senna case. Now,
Dr. Barr, before
yeah.
you advance onto the next Senna, we've got a question that came back from the pigweed.
Okay.
Casey asked, is it very palatable, or will they only eat it if that is the only choice they have and they are hungry?
That's a good question. I don't have any notes about particular palatability of pigweed, and I do find it frequently in rumen content in small amounts. So I don't think there's any unpalatability factor with this one. Sometimes you have spurred pigweeds. Some of them will have little thorny things at the base of the stems or at the joints here, and those in particular might be put off because of the thorniness of it. But my impression is not one of a case of a nasty odor or anything with pigweed. So I don't think so. If anybody else has more information on that, please let us know.
Thank you, Dr. Barr.
Sure, you ready to go on?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, so this is what sennas do to cows. So that's this muscle damage. We have another senna that grows in the Edwards Plateau in the calcareous soils and southward and westward from the Edwards Plateau. The fun part about the sennas is they affect different species differently. And so in chicken and goats, the sennas affect the cardiac muscle instead of the skeletal muscle. And so they end up with myocardial infarctions, essentially dead pieces of the heart tissue. And so if it's a big piece, they could be just dead right away. But if it's a small piece, like just having a few fibers giving them problems or a few fibers in a large muscle dying, the muscle might still function for quite a while until the animal gets stressed and suddenly they'll die because of heart failure. So chickens and goats have a different issue. Horses have liver failure from eating these sennas, whether it's this one or the coffee senna. It causes liver failure. It causes liver failure that ends up causing central nervous system signs. The liver handles all the nitrogen in the system and tries to filter it out of the blood and convert it into other things. When the liver's not working, the animal builds up ammonia in the blood, and the ammonia affects the way the brain works and eventually will kill them. This plant is not unpalatable, so they'll eat it when it's green. Every year we lose newborn lambs, well, not newborns, but 1 to 3 month old lambs to to twin leaf senna in the hill country. So
Dr. Barr, can you speak a little bit more about how twin leaf senna will affect sheep?
sheep, I don't have something specific on. So I'm really not sure whether they're going to act more like goats or like cattle. That's interesting that I don't have a note about sheep. I'm going to have to find out. Sorry, guys, I will find out. I'm writing a note. Sheep, senna. Why don't I know that?
Well, and that's a good point that Beth brings up, especially considering the density of this species in the Edwards Plateau area and sheep and goat country. So,
Yeah.
thank you, Beth, for bringing that question up.
Yeah. Does anybody know? I mean, we know what it does in goats, but I've not heard of what it does in sheep. So this is one of my favorite plants because it has all these different things that it does in different species. So it's one of the quirks and perks of being interested in toxic plants. Then we have the oaks, and you hear that oaks are toxic, but Native Americans used to make acorn flour and eat it. There's a lot of processing that goes into making acorn flour, and you have to soak those acorns to get the tannins out of them. It's a long process. So they were really careful about that when they made it. Tannins are the toxin that oaks carry, and the different oaks will carry different amounts of tannins. We talk about white oaks and black oaks, and that's partly based on the amount of tannin available. There's a whole lot of characteristics that go into that. So live oak has a very, very low amount of tannin available. And so they can go ahead and eat that pretty much however much they want, as opposed to Spanish oak or black oak, blackjack, many of the other oaks, red oaks, Shumard, those are going to have much higher tannin levels. The highest tannin in every case is going to be in the very young leaves, and this is shinri. Shin oak is really bad, mostly because it's available closer to the ground. So we've got really small leaves here, and then the catkins are the flowers of the oak, and then the acorns, of course. So we have a lot of variability there, and it depends on what oak they get into. Now, this is what it causes in cattle. So again, it's a ruminant thing. If they consume a whole lot of acorns or a whole lot of bud material early in the year, it will cause it takes a long time to poison them with it and a large amount of material. So it can take up to 3 weeks to kill a cow, and she has to eat enough of it, but it causes damage to the rumen mucosa and to the liver and the kidneys, the whole business. The clinical signs that she'll show up with, first of all, is a hunched stance, and that's kind of because her guts are hurting. Sometimes she'll kick at her belly. She'll have a tarry stool with mucus in it, and part of that is because of capillary fragility. As the kidneys are failing, it causes changes in the little capillaries, the blood vessels. So they'll end up more porous than usual, and so they'll kind of seep blood into the surrounding tissue. Well, they seep blood into the guts as well, and so digested blood is kind of tarry, and it makes the stool kind of nasty. They can also have nosebleeds or show bleeding at the vulva and the anus, and then they have kind of a sloshy rumen. If you get close enough to them to hear what's going on in the rumen, you'll hear a lot of liquid moving in there. They're trying to secrete liquid or maintain liquid in there to try to dilute the toxin. So in terms of diluting the toxin, you also end up with really swollen tissues. This is a lot more swollen than it should look. There's a lot of fluid being retained there. And then you also have pale kidneys. Remember that pale muscle when we had Senna killing the muscle tissue? This is what a kidney is not supposed to look like, okay? It's too pale, and that indicates that it's not not doing well. It's probably got a lot of dead cellular material in it, so the kidney has died. Now, the interesting thing is that this happens in cattle and goats, but our deer have evolved eating acorns, and they eat them routinely and don't seem to be affected by it. So there's been some evolutionary adaptation there. So if we know we have a bad acorn year, there are actually some diets that you can feed that will counteract some of the tannins by precipitating them within the gut so they're not absorbed. So if that becomes a problem, you can visit with your vet and talk about the prevention diet in a bad year. The next plant I've got is one that causes birth defects, and there are several of those in the plant world that will cause birth defects in animals. This one's tree tobacco, and the bad actor in it, rather than being nicotine, is actually anabasine in this particular plant, Nicotiana glauca. Some of the other Nicotianas have higher nicotine levels, as you would expect. Anabasine causes a problem called crooked calf syndrome. And so you end up with, depending on what point in pregnancy the exposure occurs, you can end up with any of these different kinds of spinal curvature problems. Arthrogryposis, you can have joint contractures, and that's where the crooked calf name comes from. So they're contracted at the tarsal joints, at the ankles and the elbows and all those kind of things. And then they can have a variety of curvatures of the spine. And then if it's really early in development, it can be a cleft palate issue. And all of this is because the animal, the fetus doesn't move as much when it's affected by anabasine. Same thing with nicotine, actually. And so you'll have a lack of motion causing a lack of proper development in these cases. So that can happen in cattle, goats, sheep, and swine when they eat tree tobacco, excuse me. This is Perilla Mint, and it's about the only plant I have that's going to cause lung problems. So in most cases, if you've got cattle or horses with breathing problems, it's not going to be a toxic plant. It's more likely to be an infectious cause. So if it's Perilla Mint or moldy sweet potatoes, that's another one. These toxins will cause a pulmonary adenomatosis. In the alveoli, you've got really, really thin cells to allow the exchange of oxygen and CO2 between the blood and the air. And when those cells become thickened by the toxins in these plants, the animal's unable to exchange oxygen and CO2. So it's an actual lung toxicity that results in them having heavy breathing. They'll stretch out their necks and be trying hard to breathe, and they end up actually suffocating because they can't get oxygen into the body. Now, where Perilla Mint grows, it can grow really thick and really tall. It can be 5 feet tall or more. In drier areas of the state, it might be present in creek beds. In wetter areas of the state, it can be out in pasture. It kind of likes a little bit of dappled shade. So it's closer to the edges of the pasture where there's a little bit of intermittent shade usually. Now the moldy sweet potato thing, that'll affect people as well. So if your sweet potatoes get moldy, you throw them away instead of eating them, please. Just for my peace of mind, I have to say that. So that's Perilla Mint. It's more of an eastern plant, and it is something that likes a lot of moisture compared to a lot of these other plants. It's also an ornamental. They've bred versions of this that have a lot more purple and sometimes curly leaves, and so you can find this at garden stores now and then. But it does grow wild. This one is Caltrop, and I have to admit I screwed up this one in your handout. It says Carelessweed, and that is Kyatia. That is not Caltrop. I noticed that this morning when I was going through the slides, and I apologize. So if you would write in, if you're using the handout, this is its real name. This is Caltrop. It's got a single taproot and it sends out runners up to 6 feet in every direction. In the middle of that plant, that's a quarter. So that gives you an idea of what size we're looking at. It's got really, really hairy leaves. You can see here on the bloom, it's got hairs all over all the plant parts, okay? And it ends up, one of its names is carpetweed because it'll have that taproot and send out almost a rug in all directions. So what this can cause is a problem, a swelling in the lumbar spine is where it starts. And the animal loses control of its hind end. So if the animals are removed from the source, if they quit eating this stuff, then the swelling goes down and function comes back. If they're on the carpetweed or the caltrops long enough to cause a permanent damage in the spinal cord, they're never going to be right again. Now, the paralysis will start at the hind end, and then it works its way forward when they're eating these plants. They'll drag themselves around like this sheep is trying to do for a while and still be able to eat for a while, but eventually they'll be unable to feed themselves or get to water, and they'll die from that if you don't find them and put them down first. These were from a feeding trial years and years ago. So that's how we know for sure that this is the plant that does it. Someone was able to perform a feeding trial in laboratory conditions. But this dog sitting thing just looks totally wrong to me. So you definitely don't want to have them getting into a large enough amount of caltrops to cause this to happen. We have a potential case of this that we're working on right now in the El Dorado area. But this is a plant that grows in most areas of Texas and northward and eastward. I'm not sure how far across the rest of the country because I'm mostly familiar with it here in Texas. But it can be bad news. But again, it's totally reversible if they don't have more of the plant to eat. So if they stop eating it, you're good. This is Chinaberry. And it makes a really nice shade tree. It's got a nice big umbrella type top, and it puts on pretty flowers, and they're kind of purple, and then it puts on these noticeable berries. It's very pretty. The berries are going to have bright yellow skins, but if it drops those berries and pigs and horses and dogs get into it, this can cause seizures. There's a CNS toxicant. It causes excitation, incoordination, trembles, and convulsions. It also causes gut irritation. So in pigs and dogs, you'll have an animal that has diarrhea and may also have seizures. In horses, it's going to cause colic. Horses can actually be poisoned just by eating the foliage. I don't think we're going to have dogs get into the foliage, but they sure will hoover up those berries when they get to the ground. The berry's the most toxic part, and inside that pit, if you've ever messed with a Chinaberry, it's got a very large pit inside that berry, and inside the pit is the highest concentration of toxin. So this is Chinaberry, Melia azedarach. Another CNS problem, central nervous system toxin, is Malta star thistle. Yellow star thistle is also encroaching on Texas from the west, and so we're starting to have more plant material that can do this to a horse. The plant is, kind of understated. It's got a rosette, and then it etiolates from there. You've got winged stems here. If you can, I don't know if you can see that very well, but it's got a stem that's clasping and winged down the sides of that stem. And every one of them is like that. So it's going to be kind of ribbony looking when you find it. And it'll put on a thistle flower. And then the base of it, these spines are shaped like a Maltese cross. I don't know if you can see this one here, but it's got barbs on the sides of it. And so that's what gives it its name, the Malta star thistle. Now this affects horses and donkeys only, and they have to be eating it for 1 to 2 months as part of their diet. and it causes necrosis in a particular part of the brain. So this little area right here, the substantia nigra, is going to be the part that's necrotic and that doesn't function in the brain if they've been eating this plant over a long period of time. So it causes problems with the facial nerves and the control of chewing and drinking and moving the tongue. So these animals will occasionally be seen with their faces kind of almost submerged in a water source trying to drink because they can't suck the water up with their tongue because they can't curl it when they want to. So eventually they'll end up starving or more likely dying of dehydration before that. So this is a really bad deal, but it's only in equines and it's only after they eat it for a longer period of time. So it's one of our interesting ones. Buckeye is another plant that causes central nervous system signs, and it grows to tree size. When it's out in a pasture, it's more shrubby, but if you think about the Ohio buckeyes, they're in the same family, and that's always going to be a relatively large tree. The tender young leaves in the spring are what animals usually end up eating. And the toxin in this causes tremors and convulsions. If you remember old chlorinated hydrocarbon pesticides, if you see an animal with buckeye poisoning, it's going to look like one that had chlorinated hydrocarbon poisoning or toxaphene poisoning. They're just tremory all the time, and that can progress to convulsions if you try to move them or if on their own eventually if they get a high enough dose. And this will affect any mammalian species. So it's got these big palmate looking leaves, deeply incised. And sometimes we'll find this growing out in a coastal pasture as just humps of this stuff out in the coastal pasture. So in the springtime is when they typically get poisoned with this plant. Don't know of any palatability issues with it, but apparently the youngest leaves are going to be the most palatable. It may be a texture thing. I don't know. The bigger leaves are kind of leathery if you go out and play with it any. Now, woolly loco, all the locos cause lesions in every tissue, but where you most often see the effect, where you'll get clinical signs, is when it causes lesions in the brain. So they're called loco weeds. So this is Astragalus mellissimus. There are a lot of Astragalus and Oxytropis species that will have Swainsonian in them. This one's been really well researched by the Poisonous Plant Research Lab out in Logan, Utah. They've done a lot of studies on the loco weeds. This causes a lysosomal storage disease. So the lysosome is the part of the cell that is used to remove wastes and recycle them by breaking them down. So if you prevent the cell from being able to break down its own waste, you end up with what's called cellular constipation. You just end up with a cell where this one organelle, the lysosome, gets bigger and bigger and bigger because it can't break down what it's collecting. And it can cause cell death in a lot of different kinds of tissues. This will affect any species that we've got. One of the best known effect is the neurological deficit. And if you remember the story of Custer's Last Stand, where the horses went a bit crazy, the theory is that they got into loco weeds and that's what affected their brains. If horses get into loco, they may recover a little bit, but they're never going to be safe to ride again because their brain function is affected. This plant also causes reproductive failure because it affects the testes and the ovaries and the cells that are produced there. And it can cause abortion as well, because if it crosses the placenta into the fetus, it can affect growth and development there. So it causes a whole bunch of trouble. Also causes high mountain disease because it affects the lung tissue. And so animals may have trouble breathing at higher elevations because of loco ingestion. So it's got a whole lot of effects, but we think of it as crazy weed, mostly because it shows up as a brain thing.
Dr. Barr, going back to Buckeye from the previous slide, Noel has asked, are the seeds of Mexican Buckeye also toxic?
I am having trouble with that plant because I have found different opinions on that. Buckeye is toxic. Mexican Buckeye, Ungnatia, I'm having trouble proving it. It's not listed in Burroughs and Turrell, the toxic plants of North America, as being toxic.
Dr. Barr, we also have a second question of how much does an animal have to eat to have an effect? And I'm going to guess this is regarding the woolly loco on your next slide.
Well, any of these plants, it's going to depend. Okay, I hate to be wishy-washy. Some of them we do have numbers on, like the oleander. It's not going to take much, but it's going to vary from plant to plant and from animal individual to animal individual how much they have to eat to be affected. So the plants produce the toxins in response to things in the environment. And how much they produce is going to depend on the environmental conditions. It may be rainfall, it may be the soil type that it's growing on. And so individual plants of the same genus and species will produce different toxins. Not different toxins necessarily, but different toxin profiles or toxin amounts. And the same happens with the animals. They're going to have a slightly different response from individual to individual, the same way humans do to drugs that we're given. So different people have different sensitivities. So in some cases, you can say that they have to eat, half an acre of straight loco in a 3-day period, and that's enough to do it. But it's, and don't take that to the bank because I'm making it up. I'm not looking at the book right now. But the doses that we do know are in the toxic plants of Texas. And you may be able to look those up online as well. For example, I could tell you that the Malta-star thistle, they have to eat it for a couple of months as part of their diet before it's enough. Mesquite, we think of as a great forage, unless they eat it as 60% of their diet, mesquite beans themselves, as 60% of their diet for at least 60 days, and then it's a problem. So it depends on the plant, it depends on where it's growing, and sometimes we know and sometimes we don't, because there's not a lot of money put into plant research. And many of our observations are just that. They're observations, they're anecdotal. So unless there's been a feeding study, we're not certain of how much it takes. So it's not getting off the hook. There are actual numbers and amounts in some cases, but it's rare. We're going to have to keep going because I'm just looking down and it's 10 to 1 and we're not there yet. This is Jimson weed. It's going to cause both central nervous system signs and gut signs. So we're shifting over to plants that cause GI irritation or other problems in the gut here. This one is the classic plant from the Jamestown colony, where they talked about being dry as a bone, mad as a hatter, blind as a bat, all that kind of thing. And the reason is because this plant has atropine, scopolamine, and hyoscamine in it. And those are, atropine's used in surgeries now because it dries up your mucous membranes. It keeps you from slobbering all over the table when you're in surgery. It also stops you from having diarrhea while you're there. But this plant is very much available in the wild. Some people grow it in their flower beds. It will cause the gut to dry up and a body temperature elevation. Animals can act blind and they can jump at nothing that's out there. So Jimson weed can be a very interesting plant. This one in particular is quercifolia, which is the one that grows down in Big Bend. So I know where we took this picture. And this is a quercifolia thorn apple, if you're wondering. Silverleaf nightshade is going to be mostly gut and some central nervous system issues. Nightshades and the Jimson weed are in the same family of the Solanaceae. So silverleaf nightshade is going to cause GI irritation, so animals will have the scours, or in horses they'll colic. It'll cause incoordination due to effects on the brain, and then central nervous depression. So central nervous system depression. So you may have an animal that isolates itself, and its stance may be a head down stance because it's not paying a whole lot of attention to reality. This happens mostly in cattle and horses. Sheep and goats are less sensitive. The green berries are the most toxic part of the plant. And this is one that is kind of notorious for having a problem, especially when it's been treated with herbicide and people leave the animals in the pasture, because they will just eat the heck out of this stuff if it's been treated with herbicide and get poisoned with it, even if there's no berries on it. The whole plant is toxic. A couple other nightshades that cause similar problems. This is potato weed, Solanum dimidiatum. It's a little bit more westward growing, and it has bigger berries on it. These are the size of quarters for the most part, where the ones on the silverleaf nightshade are more the size of dimes. And this is buffalo burr, which is different because it has a very different leaf shape and flower color, and then it has these burrs on it that are a lot more like the Jimson weed. So you can see how they're related. This one tends to get baled into hay. Nobody's going to go after this thing that's so spiny and eat it on purpose, but if it's baled into hay, they'll sure eat it. And then my least favorite plant ever is anything that contains pyrrolizidine alkaloids. And the plant that we have in Texas that has most pyrrolizidine alkaloids is Senecio genus. Pyrrolizidine alkaloids are a toxin that causes liver damage that's progressive and irreversible. It causes the liver tissue to convert to scar tissue. So you can see this is very light colored. That's all scar tissue that has replaced the cells. So this liver's not functioning anymore. There may be a little bit of function over here where it's still the right color, but most of that liver has been replaced with fibrous tissue that doesn't do anything for you. Senecio poisoning, being progressive, can show up 6 weeks to 2 years after the animal ate the plant that poisoned it. So it's kind of insidious, it's sneaky. The animals will go along just fine for a while, and then they lose weight, and then they lose more weight because they're off feed and they're depressed. They may walk around aimlessly, they may act a little blind, they may head press because there's some headache going on with this, because remember I talked about how the liver takes care of all the ammonia in the blood, and when it quits working, the ammonia builds up and poisons the brain. They may have convulsions, and most of them go into a coma and die, but it's because of the liver damage that it does this. So here in Texas, we've got both annual and perennial Senecios. This is an annual, it's Texas groundsel. It's an early season annual, and we think that the time it's most often eaten is as a winter rosette early in the season, because at that point it's the greenest thing out there in the pasture. The rosette has purple backed leaves and it has purple stripes in the stem. The flowers are composites. So it's one of those daisy looking things, and they're hard to identify from other daisy looking things unless you know what you're doing. So right now it looks exactly like this. I took pictures of it this last weekend and they look just like this plant. So this was probably toxic back in, or was probably consumed earlier in the season, late December, early January. It's less toxic when it's blooming. So if you've got animals that die from this poisoning, you need to identify it while it's blooming and then go back in the following winter and treat it with herbicide. It's pretty easy to get rid of if you can treat it as it's etiolating. So either as the rosette or as it's starting to rise up with the sunshine and the temperature coming up. So Texas groundsel, this is one of our annuals. It grows through the whole center of Texas and northward. To the east, we've got Senecio glabellus or butterweed. And then there are perennial groundsels or Senecios are more in our western and South Texas areas. This is Riddle's groundsel, and it's got a very green look to it. I think the leaves are glabrous. There's no hairs on them. Again, it's got the composite flower, but this plant is out there all year long, and sometimes it grows this thick in the pastures in West Texas. So it's available for the animals to eat from all year long. This one and its cousin, Senecio, let's see, Douglasii, no, Longilobus, no, it's changed names several times recently. Anyway, its threadleaf groundsel is much grayer looking because it's got a lot of hairiness to it, but it lives in the same general area, and those two are both perennials that are available a lot of the year. So this can affect horses, cattle, sheep, and goats are a little less affected by it, and it causes that progressive liver damage due to the pyrrolizidine alkaloids that are in it. So this is, again, like I said, my least favorite genus in Texas. So how do we know what the animals got into? I'm going to show you how I do this in the lab. I've got a set of sieves that I set up in the sink, and sorry, it's hard to talk to a video that you know is so slow. That's a rumen contents sample, and that was a little one. I really want about a quart of rumen contents. We wash it through the sieves so that it separates by size, and you can tell different things from what's in the pans. The top one's going to be the stuff they ate most recently because it's the biggest pieces. They haven't had a chance to ruminate it yet. The middle, I don't pay too much attention to unless there's something interesting in there. The small stuff is where I get the most bang for my buck because that's where the pieces are going to be small enough and broken down enough that I can put it under the microscope and see what the structures are. If you think about it, grass is all going to have parallel veins. And so it's all going to look very similar, and not much in the way of grass is toxic in Texas. So I can ignore all that. It's the broadleaf weeds that cause our problems. So these are examples of some of the things we can identify under the microscope from the rumen contents. Lantana's got a very distinctive trichome and a base of the trichome with these large cells around it that's very easy to identify. This is twin leaf senna, and it has little curved hairs on it that are stippled. They've got little warts all over them. And if you've got it folded up, this looks kind of like a herd of bulls running to me. So that's kind of how I remember what I'm looking for when it's twin leaf senna. And this is the seed coat on silverleaf nightshade, which is pretty distinctive. So we can find pieces of this in the rumen content when animals have been eating those berries. So this is how we figure out what the animals have been into when we get rumen content sent to the lab. Just so you know how that we know the animals are getting into this. This is one of the ways. That's what I have for you today, and I'm sorry we pushed it so close. Please, if anybody's got questions, email me. If there's anything that you need, that you know about these plants that would help me to understand them better, please let me know. I'd be really grateful. I'm sorry we went so close, guys.
Dr. Barr, that was absolutely fascinating. I'm sure probably all of our participants would have watched you for another hour or so. And I really appreciate that video that you showed of you in the lab, because oftentimes I wonder how do y'all even approach rumen content like that. So thank you so much for the information, and for providing your contact information too. We really appreciate it.